everyone, good evening. I'm really thrilled to kick off this event, which is the second in our program for 2020-2021. We've had many people registering from different countries, which is very promising, and it is a testimony to the interest of the topic that we are about to discuss. Very short sort of housekeeping notes. So please keep your mic muted. When we will open the debate, please write in the chat if you have a question, and only unmute yourself when I call your name. We are recording this event, and we will just stop the recording just before the Q&A. So let me thank all of our speakers, all our 3 speakers for accepting our invitation. Let me thank also my colleagues, Ilaria Favretto, Maurizio Isabella, Axel Körner, Nico Pizzolato, and Joseph Viscomi, with whom I shared the convenership of this seminar series. And let me thank the Institute of Historical Research for hosting our seminar. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers very briefly, because our time should be reserved for the talk and the discussion. And then I'm sure you are all familiar with them. I'm delighted to welcome Silvana Patriarca, our main speaker. Thanks for accepting our invitation, Silvana. Silvana is Professor of History at Fordham University. Her latest book, Italian Vices, Nation and Character from the Risorgimento to the Republic, came out for CUP in 2013. More recently, she has co-edited a special issue of Modern Italy dedicated to nation, race, and racism in 20th century Italy. And I'm very happy to announce that her new book, Race in Post-Fascist Italy, War, Children, and the Color of the Nation, will be out in the autumn of next year, 2021. I'm going to present our 2 respondents now, so that we don't lose time later. Paul Gilroy is our first respondent. Thanks for being with us today. And well, since the 1980s, really, his work has transformed the way we think about race and racism, and continues to be a constant inspiration across disciplinary boundaries, always challenging established patterns and paradigms. So really, thank you for being here. Paul joined UCL in 2019 as Professor of the Humanities, and he's founding director of the Sarah Parker Remond Center for the Study of Racism and Racialization. John Foote, thanks John for being here with us, is Professor of Modern Italian History at the University of Bristol. Really all scholars and students working on 20th century Italy are familiar with his work and his many publications, ranging from the history of football to the history of psychiatry. He's currently working on a new book on fascism to be published in 2022, and we all look forward to reading that. Now, finally, I leave the floor to Silvana for her talk, Vorrei la pelle nera, Youth Culture and Anti-racist Sensibilities in 1960s and 1970s Italy.
Thank you very much, Carlotta and Ilaria, for inviting me to this seminar, and also to the respondents for accepting to be here today. I know it's a very busy time for everybody, so I really appreciate your being here. And I would like to, in particular, to express that I feel very honored to meet Paul, because we never met. I know your work, but it's great to meet you. And I'm very happy to see John, whom I saw in New York just before the pandemic. So that was quite some luck there. Since I'm presenting a work in progress today, I particularly welcome your feedback. So, Vorrei la pelle nera, I want black skin, is a refrain of the hit song of 1967 by an Italo-French singer named Nino Ferrer. And some of you may remember him. Why did the blonde Ferrer want a black skin? The song tells us of a frustrated white singer who would like to have the voice of the African-American performers who were very popular in Europe at the time, such as Wilson Pickett, James Brown, that he names. He's frustrated not only because he says being Black, he can't have a Black voice in spite of all his efforts, but also because his own language is not well adapted to the new musical rhythm. The song briefly refers to American racism and expresses an anti-racist feeling, but it mainly conveys a fascination and perhaps a feeling of envy towards African-American musicians, their musical skills, along with a frustrated desire for appropriating their voice and music. The two, a desire to emulate and appropriate Black music and experience, and some anti-racist feelings, or at least a desire to express them, came together in the Italian youth sensibilities of the 1960s and 1970s. In my talk, I will give you some example of this convergence, and I will make some reflection on its characteristics and implications. But first, let me explain where this interest of mine comes from. In the past few years, I've worked on a book project on race and nation in post-fascist and post-colonial Italy. That project, which focuses on the experiences and representation of the biracial Italians born at the end of World War II, from the encounter between Italian women and African-American soldiers, is almost completed. But it left me with a number of questions which need further investigation. One of these concerns the history of anti-racism. Studies on the history of anti-racism in post-45 Italy are very few, and they concern primarily, of course, the period, the most recent period. This may be understandable since there was not much of it before racism became very visible in the behavior of the Italian population from the 1980s onwards. And still today, of course, there is not much of this anti-racism very effective in Italy. In the period that I studied, between 45 and 1980, Italians of non-European descent were a very small minority and were generally invisible, or more precisely, invisibilized. But as racism exists, even when its targets are absent, anti-racist feelings and ideas can exist too, even in the absence of overt racism. After the fall of fascism, the country convinced itself that it was not racist, as if that racist regime alongside 60 years of colonialism had no impact on ways of thinking and behaving after its fall. Racism, in other words, was a thing of the past, like fascism. It was collapsed with fascism and was seen as having no real indigenous roots, if we exclude anti-Southern racism. This view of racism as a purely fascist phenomenon was present not only in mainstream opinion, but also on the left, which tended to underestimate the impact of the Italian colonial experience. However, signs that a specific anti-racist sensibility was emerging in the 60s do exist. By sensibility, I mean a rather loose set of beliefs, feelings, tastes, attitudes, and moral values. And this anti-racist sensibility was emerging primarily among the Italian youth with a leftist orientation, both Catholic and secular. The anti-racism of white Italians was focused pretty much exclusively on the racism of others, and in particular on the racism of a specific country, the US, and was shaped by its reception of that specific anti-racist struggles that were taking place in that country. The Italian left, and especially the new left, follow closely the struggles of Black Americans, and especially the militancy of Black power. The main text of the Black struggle, from the autobiography of Malcolm X to the prison letters of George Jackson and the essays of Eldridge Cleaver, were immediately translated by major publishers. Organizations of the New Left used the example of the struggles of American Blacks in their own struggles. Here you have a cover from of a book published by Lotta Continuo to document the interventions, its intervention in the Italian prisons. And here you have covers of the books that were immediately translated by Einaudi, so this most important Italian publisher. Italian leftists welcome Black struggles as evidence of the problems of the advanced capitalistic system embodied in American society. They welcomed them as a source of inspiration for regenerating the revolutionary struggle in Europe. Within a Marxist framework, they were immediately appropriated, these struggles were immediately appropriated for their larger implications, acquiring a different and larger meaning. An Italian commentator of Fanon, for example, claimed that what Fanon really meant by Black was exploited. It is indicative of this attitude that, in contrast to the Wretched of the Earth, which had a huge success in Italy, Black Skin, White Masks was not a text that received much attention at that time. Not to mention that it appeared with a very misguided title, Il Negro e l'Altro, the Negro and the Other. Allow me just a little piece of ego history here. I have a copy of this book, which I bought in the 70s. And from what I can tell now, I did not read much of it. In contrast to the Wretched of the Earth, which acquired at the time the status of a sacred text, and that was given to me by for my birthday by my classmates. Since I mentioned Fanon, we should recall that the Italian left embrace of Black power had a parallel in its embrace of terzomundismo, third worldism, the view that the struggle of the Third World were the harbinger of a revolution that hopefully would extend to the West. These two essentially implied a focus on the colonialism of others, not on Italian colonialism. But embracing the struggles of others does not necessarily mean developing an understanding of the racism these others face, or of the working of racism more generally. By the way, this is an issue that whites who want to be allies today of Black and brown people in the struggle face on a regular basis, the need to overcome the actual distance and lack of education on matters of race and racism. So the first point I want to stress here is this lack of an autonomous reflection of racism. So on its origins, on roots, mechanism in the Italian left of the 1960s and 70s. A reflection so distinct from the strong sympathy for the cause of anti-colonialism and for the Black American struggle, which benefited, of course, also from the climate of the Cold War. However, there is another area worth looking at when researching the history of anti-racism, and this is the area of popular music. In those same years, the musical scene in Italy was being increasingly receptive towards African-American musicians. It was, of course, the Italian youth, like the youth elsewhere in Europe, who consumed African-American music and culture. But Black artists were also popular among television audiences. And I can show you some here of the sort of the more popular performers who were commonly on sort of mainstream television works. There is also an interracial duo was very popular at the time, won several prizes in festivals, both in Italy and in Europe. The 1960s were also the decade in which new music periodicals catering to the youth began to be published. One of these was Ciao 2001, Hello 2001, a music magazine with leftist sympathies, which had a run of about 80,000 copies in the mid-70s, but it was more likely to be read by a larger number of people. It started publication in 1969 from the merging of two other youth music magazines. The magazine published hundreds of articles on Black artists, and thus it is a good source for accessing constructions of Blackness and race that circulated among middle-brow cultural operators and their public, as distinct from leftist intellectual and activist. It also raises questions about the meaning of the consumption of Black music and its appropriation by Italian musicians. Scholars of consumption have shown how active consumptions carry their own cultural politics and can also lead to other forms of political and organizational consciousness. This is well known in the case of the formation of youth subjectivities in the 1950s and 1960s. The consumption of specific music genres by the youth was not only a very important shaper of identities, but was often a vehicle of values alternative to the dominant ones. Regarding more specifically the consumption of race, while scholars such as Bell Hooks have rightly criticized the commodification of the other and the racism implicit in cultural appropriation, she and others have also pointed out that cultural appropriation can be a vehicle for an exchange that is respectful of the other's individuality, albeit not devoid of some stereotyping. It is on this issue of consumption of appropriation which I want to focus the rest of my remarks. The consumption of Black music may be interpreted as a case of Blacophilia, a phenomenon with some precedents in European history, if we go back to the 1920s and so on. Blacophilia is not necessarily an indicator of anti-racism, but it is often a more ambivalent phenomenon. I mean, I'm thinking about white rappers who imitate the language and style of Black artists because they consider them cool and not for political reasons. But to consider only this aspect would be reductive because in the 60s and 70s, the fascination with Black music occurred in the context of a crisis of bourgeois domination and in the context of a challenge to white hegemony. For the many young people who in the 60s and 70s revolted against social conformists and what was known as the system, the consumption of non-Italian music, and especially of Black music, from jazz to blues to rock, was a way to escape from the limitation of the world of middle-class white people in which they felt they were confined, and was a way to express their cosmopolitanism or their aspiration to being cosmopolitan, to go beyond the confines of the places where they lived. And this can actually be seen very clearly in reading, for example, the correspondence of the young people who write to this journal, Ciao 2001. At the same time, the interest in Black music was also the expression of a new, genuine sensibility for the African-American condition, and in particular, a sympathy for those Blacks who were in revolt against white supremacy and the system. A magazine like Ciao 2001 contributed to foster this sensibility. It offered its readers not only information about the production and the concerts of the African-American stars at the time in the world of jazz, rock, rhythm and blues and soul, but also several series of articles on the history of these musical genres, as well on the history of the Black struggle in the US from the origins to the present. These various series place the development of Black music in the context of the American Black history and experience. Right from the beginning, right from the 19th century on. The decision to publish these series met the demands of the readers. In the letters to the director column of the magazine, readers asked for suggestions on what to read about the struggles. And also they sort of, mentioned what they did in their own localities, in connection to their concerns about racism, although they also admitted that they didn't find a lot of that. But in their interviews, journalists asked Black artists about their experience of racism. And of course, there was always the question, do you think that Italy is a racist country? Of course, it was a rhetorical question. There was, in other words, among the youth, a desire to understand and to educate oneself about racism. And the magazine tried to address and respond to that desire. While the magazines made some efforts to explain the history of Blacks and their struggles in America, it showed almost no awareness of the existence of Black biracial Italians from the former colonies. And in general, I have to say, very little interest at the time for African music, in African musics. These, to be sure, were still very few. I mean, the Black and biracial Italians from the former colonies who lived in Italy at the time were still very few. But the lack of curiosity towards the Italian colonial past is nevertheless remarkable. When the magazine interviewed Lara St. Paul, an Italian, a popular Italo-Eritrean singer who was born in 1946, she denounced the fact that Italians fixated on her skin's color rather than on her musical talent. But the issue was not further explored. At the same time, as in the case of other female performers, the magazine focused more on her good looks than on her music, evoking the trope of the Black Venus. There was another biracial Italian musician who became prominent in the 1960s and 1970s. His name was James Senese. He was born in 1945 from the relationship between James Smith, an African-American GI, and Anna Senese, a young woman from Naples. With this creative fusion of rhythm and sounds of various origins, jazz, blues, rock, but also Southern folk music, Senese was a central figure in the renewal of the musical scene in Naples and more generally in the Italy of the 1960s and 1970s. He continues to be active and popular today. In the magazine, James Senese was introduced as an Italian American without reference to his African American heritage and his skin color. In the 1960s and 1970s, issue did not seem particularly interested in underlining this mixed background, even though one of his musical compositions of 1976 made an explicit reference to it in its title. It was entitled Sangue Misto, Mixed Blood. Senese also spoke about the need to create different languages and rhythm in music because, and I'm quoting, only in this way one can reach truth and true culture. But the personal experiences of Senese did not seem to interest the journalist of Ciao 2001. And at that time, he himself did not seem to claim this sort of Black component of his identity, as in contrast he has done in more recent interviews, when he has become very vocal about his experience, also growing up in Naples and being subjected to abuse by other children because of the color of the skin and because of his origins. Paradoxically, it was an Italian musician who claimed his own Blackness. The term that he used was negritude, right, which probably comes from the French negritude. His name is Pino Daniele, a former collaborator of James Senese, and very influenced by him. Daniele became a national star at the end of the 1970s with an hybrid musical genre combining jazz, rock, and melody, and singing in Neapolitan dialect or with a mix of Neapolitan and Italian. One of his most famous albums, released in 1980, was entitled Nero a metà, Half Black. Who was the half black of the title? The album appears to be dedicated to Mario Musella, a musician born in Naples in the same circumstances as James Senese, namely right at the end of World War II, from a Native American father who was a soldier in Italy and a Neapolitan mother. But Nero a metà was applied in particular to Daniele himself. So the real, right, in the minds of those who listen to this music, Daniele was the half black here in the story. And the idea of Daniele as a half black is still very common today. In a recent interview to James Senese, the journalist makes this claim, right? I mean, Daniele was half black, to which Senese replies that in reality, the true half black was me or Mario, but it was okay, no difference. Our lives were an inspiration to widen the boundaries of music. In those years, there were no barriers, either political or cultural, that could divide us. We experienced it in that way. It is impossible not to perceive a certain more than justified irritation on the part of Senese for Daniele's appropriation. And of course, Daniele is the guy who became very famous at the time, much more than Senese. Of negritude, Daniele had a rather peculiar idea, consisting of a vision in which stereotypes of Blacks converge with those of Neapolitans. In '79, Daniele described himself as a Negro, and he used the term negro, so the term was common in use at the time, adding, I'm not very interested in the future, wealth, appearances. What I want is simply to play and have fun, even though it's a tight-lipped fun. When the album Nero a metà was launched in March 1980, Ciao 2001 maintained that the title of Daniele's album, I'm quoting, almost exposes the blackness of a not very conventional Neapolitan, without the smoking Vesuvius, but with the colors and the sounds of the crowded back alleys. As it appears from these quotations, the appropriation of a positive idea of blackness took place with a good amount of racial stereotyping, even if in Daniele's word, there was no offensive intention. At the same time, stereotypes were frequent also in the description of Naples, presented in the magazine. Naples was described as an orient behind the counter, the corner, where, I'm quoting, rage and rhythm were everywhere. In other words, negritude and Napoletanità overlapped at various levels. The presence of an internal anti-Southern racism may have helped to develop sympathy for an identification with Black struggles, but it also worked to elide the significant differences that existed in the oppression experienced by these different groups of people. Now, to conclude, I have assembled these few shreds of this fairly recent past because I think that they should belong in a history of anti-racism that is still to be written, and that it started to be written now, anti-racism in Italy. An anti-racist movement in Italy started only at the end of the 1980s, after the killing of Jerry Masslo, a South African asylum seeker who was working in the tomato fields in a town near Naples. By then, racism in Italian society had become very visible as its targets has increased. And Italian society finally discovered that there were a lot of people with a Black skin who were invisible but were working, right, in many sectors of the economy and were being abused in many ways. There is also another reason for studying this history, and that has to do also, for me, at least personally, with the current political moment in which, after years of right-wing hegemony, there's a little feeling of new possibilities and openings. The global impact of the Black Lives Matter movement has shown that there are also in Italy quite a few white people ready to support the fight, but also that they need to educate themselves and to be ready for the long haul. But the simple and momentary appropriation of other people's struggles will not be enough to sustain a credible movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvana. Thank you so much for this fascinating paper, and also for really remaining within the time limits. So really thank you. And I'm delighted now to leave the floor to Paul Gilroy, our first respondent, for his comments. Paul, please.
Well, thank you very much, Silvana. Immensely stimulating paper, provokes lots of interesting questions in my mind. I'm not familiar with some of this, but I wonder, I hate it when in responding to a paper, one simply makes a list of the things that you want the other person to develop more. So I'm not going to do that, but I will just try to improvise some of my own feelings about what you said. The first thing that strikes me is that to periodize this historically, one has to be very, very careful about the sources of this engagement or exposure to African-American culture as it travels the world, particularly during the Cold War period. I found myself thinking about Vittorio De Grazia's work on the penetration of US culture into Europe, and wondering if that kind of perspective might be supplemented a little bit further in this project with some reflection on the role of African, or the place of African-American culture specifically, in the cultural and military diplomacy of the US during this period. For example, you know, obviously, because I'm older than all of you, I would just simply say that being able to listen to African-American music on European radio was a very difficult thing to do. And in our country, and the situation isn't, of course, exactly the same elsewhere in Europe, we were, one of the sources for that was the US Forces Broadcasting, which was a place during this period in the late 60s and early 70s where you could hear African-American music being played. You could hear jazz being played. I mean, the French radio was a little different. We used to listen to that as well. So I found myself wondering, in particularly when you began to speak about Daniele and his relationship to this, and the what's the word, intersection of Neapolitan language and Neapolitan feeling with the imagined and in some ways problematic fantasies of African-American life, albeit in its postures of suffering, about the effect of the what's it called, the US, not the US forces, what's it, the NATO Southern Command, which was of course based in Napoli, and I remember the late African-American political theorist Mark Sawyer, someone I had the pleasure of talking to many years ago, who had grown up on that base, who talked to me in some detail about the effect of the base and its proximity, its impact on the life of the city, and the forms of exchange and intimacy with African-American cultural forms so there's a, you know, we're also, I think, indebted to the work of Penny von Eschen and Lisa Davenport for their work on the place of African-American music in US military and cultural diplomacy. So that's one area. It's the Allied Forces Southern Europe. It's come to me now. That's I think it got rebranded as NATO a little bit after that. Okay, the other thing that struck me about the periodization really is at the same time you've got Daniele being half black. By the time that's happening, sort of 79, 80, you've got Mauro Malvasi from Mirandola, who's been to New York, created, you know, the Italian African-American disco fusion project Change, and to avoid the problems, or perhaps not avoid them entirely, but to manage the difficulties that you cite, has hired Luther Vandross as the voice of Change. So you have this music which is recorded simultaneously, well, not simultaneously, I don't know where they did which tracks, but the final product relies on musicians who've recorded in Milan, musicians who've recorded in New York, and the voice of it. I haven't got it here in front of me today, so I haven't looked up who did the mixing and mastering and all those kinds of things. But we're already into a cultural product, a cultural commodity, which has got multiple sources. And actually, I would submit, takes us away from any simple notion of cultural appropriation or misappropriation. It's already, you know, I hate this word. It should stay in the pig breeders vocabulary and not go further, but it's a hybrid of a very subtle and very complex kind, and that's sort of 1982. So I'm thinking about that as well, about at what point one begins to say, well, actually, the nature of traveling culture, it's mutable, particularly with music. You know, there are a number of things one can say about that. Okay, and actually the history of not just of the, as it were, passive consumption of African-American music sourced elsewhere, but the you know, the development of a jazz culture in Italy. And similar things might be said about blues too, actually, but the periodization will be somewhat different. I mean, one thinks of someone like Paolo Fresu in a sort of Sardinian context and so on. So there's a whole apparatus of this, and I want to know who's teaching these people to play, where are they learning, what are the conservatories doing, how are they managing the transmission of musical education in these idioms as they become more important to the general sort of competence of a professional musician in who wants to earn a living and has to be able to move in and out of different genres and styles of music in order to appear plausible. Yeah, I mean, the question of how, you know, how the Italian left manages its relationship with Italian colonial history and the history of that underestimation, I think I do find fascinating also. And well, yeah, I mean, that opens up a whole other set of questions which are really peripheral to the presentation, the wonderful presentation you've offered us this evening. What else have I got written down? Senese was not known to me, I'm ashamed to say. I mean, the idea of really let's return to this question of cultural appropriation, not in its relationship to music, but in the trope of negrophilia that you offered, and this sort of idea. We're all familiar, I think those of us who work on the history of racism, with an appetite for the culture, particularly of African Americans, but of other, Black and post-colonial peoples, which doesn't extend to an appreciation of or a love of the people who produce that culture. So that's a sort of that's a basic problem that we have to manage. But I do wonder really about whether the African American discussion of cultural appropriation is really something that we should defer to terribly. I mean, for every example of exploitative and cynical theft, and one can identify, and of course there's happily there is a kind of archive of litigation here, which helps to see, who wrote the checks to whom and who didn't, and who got taken to court for stealing what and under what circumstances. We do have that archive. For every component or chapter in that archive, there's a much more challenging, much more difficult, much more troubling story about the nature of culture itself. And all of that is, I think, multiplied, augmented when we start to think about music as a non-representational form which escapes the disciplinary powers exercised over it by cultural nationalists of one kind or another. So I suppose I would really plead with you not to defer too much to that particular ecology with regard to African American discussions about these things, because I think the history of all of this in Europe is very different. And I remember going to talk to Richard Wright's widow, Ellen Wright, in their apartment in Paris, and asking her about the role of the Maquis groups, the anti-fascist resistance, in the translation of some of his work into European languages, So these things are really, really complex in this context. And I don't think we have anything to gain from making them appear more simple than they really were. But thank you for a wonderful, stimulating talk. I really, really enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you, Paul, for these comments, which really open up so many questions, and we would need a very long discussion to get over all of your comments. But now I'm also delighted to leave the floor to our second respondent, John Foote, and then, of course, Silvana will have her chance to reply. John, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much to Silvana and Paul and Carlotta and Ilaria for organising this. I've got kind of some fragmentary points, really. Some of them to do with Italian racism, some of them to do with your methodology, some of them to do with the comparison with internal Italian racisms against the South, and the ones that you're talking about, and the way that they're fascinatingly coming together in very weird and interesting ways that you sort of brought out in some of your paper in a much longer way in your article. And then I wanted what came to mind a lot was some of the other areas where this digging around that you're doing could go on. And I want to think, I've been thinking since I read your paper about sport, and I just want to say something about that towards the end, about the Black presence in Italy in sport and how that has always been important. But I was thinking back that nobody has done anything on that in the 60s and 70s, and it really would be an amazing place to go. So to start off with, I just really like the way your paper is so original, and the way you're digging with these sources that no one really thinks about using. Ciao, 2001. Who would think about that as a source? But actually it's a brilliant source. It's this really hybrid, I mean, I know that word is horrible, as Paul said, but it's this incredible mixture of teen culture, politics, and it's one of those things that the Italians do really well, is those kind of productions which are really multicultural going in all, and with incredible photography in them as well. And those magazines are, I mean, so rich, and they're not just teen magazines or whatever. They're going in all kinds of directions. So that source is so rich, and I'd like to hear more about that. And this is the way that you're digging. You're kind of re-establishing a different kind of chronology about a lot of the things that we think we know about Italy. That is, there's no black people till 1980. I mean, of course, that's a massive generalization, but that's what a lot of people will tell you. And then, you know, there's no racism, there's no anti-racism until 1980 or 1990, and that's clearly not the case. You know, we kind of know that, but what you're doing is bringing out all these stories that are really incredibly hidden, and not just submerged, but really, really deep down in these places and these niches that you're bringing them out. So it's a kind of counter history, and I really think it's so exciting, and it made me really think about so many things when I was reading it. Few points about some of the things that you bring out. I was thinking about class as opposed to race a bit, and what's going on with these musicians, and you know, why are they accepted? Why are they popular? And of course they're popular maybe because they're good at singing, or maybe because they're not. And I'll come back to someone called Rocky Roberts in a little bit, who I want to talk about a little bit. But isn't there something also about glamour and class, and these kind of people, kind of the singers that you portray or talk about, not so much Senese, but the first ones that you talk about, kind of already have a kind of exalted status anyway, and that means that they're not. I'm thinking of a comparison with the 80s and 90s. They're not the people just off the boat who are where the racism is directed, mass racism, right? In that period, the vous comprare, that terrible word, which that terrible phrase, which is still used in Italian newspapers to describe people selling things on the street. You know, that word could not be used for the people you're talking about. So there's something going on about the status, the artistic status, which kind of makes something different happen. And I wonder whether you might want to think about digging there a bit, in terms of how they're represented, and they kind of the role they play, like they might in cinema or theatre or poetry, or, you know, I don't know about the role of James Baldwin in Italy, if anyone's worked on that. I think that would be a really interesting kind of sub area. So that kind of nerophilia is a stereotype. It is a fascination, a fetishization. That photo you showed of the singer with her body really, you know, all over that cover is you know, there's something very interesting about that photo, and I think that continues right through to today in many ways. That fascination, horror, fetishization, attraction, all at the same time, with that kind of different thing that is hard to relate to. I remember the famous case of when Miss Italia was elected, and it was a black woman, and, you know, half of Italy went completely mad. There was an amazing debate about it. And I was thinking the roots of all that are in your stuff. I think we need to move the chronology back and look around then. And so there's a kind of toleration. I was going back to my point about class, a toleration that's not there for the people who come later. And they're moving in a different kind of level. And not Senese, though. I don't think Senese is a different thing. And it's, you also talk about him elsewhere. And I also refer back to your article in Modern Italy, where some of the material there. In terms of the politics, the civil rights movement and the left in Italy, again, I think there's a kind of, I don't want to use the word appropriation, but you know, jumping onto the bandwagon of lots of things, using these phrases back on Latin American violent movements, and kind of calling yourself after that. And I don't want to be sort of condescending about it. I think there was, but it was also, there was a kind of superficiality about it, as there was in the UK, I think, in often as well. And I just, yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. But it's always, as you say, and I think that's a fascinating point, it's always about an American struggle, isn't it? It's never referred back. It's as if Italy doesn't count in any way. We're never going to talk about Haile Selassie, but we are going to talk a lot about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and we're not going to make any connection with that. There really is kind of brick wall between those. probably not implicitly, but certainly explicitly. And Paul's question about the left and empire is such an important one, I think. And it's just not talked about ever, as far as I can see. And I may stand corrected on that. Rocky Roberts, you mention him, but I mean, he deserves a lot more space, doesn't he? And also he's around for so long. But is he a kind of joke figure? Is he kind of brought out? I don't know about, you know, he makes a career in Italy that maybe he wouldn't have had a career elsewhere. Why does he have that career? He only seems to have one song, as far as I can see. And even when I was there in the 90s, he'd still be brought out to sing this one song, Stasera Minuto, with his terrible accent, which I've just tried to recreate. But he's a really interesting figure.
It's actually he was also in those films, you know, they had a lot of movies also. It was acting, you know, Lola, Falana and Rocky Roberts were acting in these movies for teens.
He's a proper star, but
it's actually very interesting.
Yeah, there's something really fascinating about him, and his presence in Italy as well. Racism against Southerners, racism against Black people. I mean, this is probably the area where I've done work where I can actually talk from some point of expertise, but you know, and I'm making a fairly obvious point, but I think there'd be really interesting points to be drawn on about Italian whiteness and how does that work, and some of the literature on whiteness. What does it mean for an Italian to reference themselves as white, and how does that refer to internal national identity and external forms of national identity? And I don't know if I don't see a lot of material on that, especially in the period you're talking about, especially with the fact that the Southerners are racialized. I mean, there's tons of material on that. And when they come to the north, and the use of the words like Africa, use of the words like Casbah for the places where they live in Milan, you know, that racialization of the Southerners and even people from the north of Italy as well. And this idea that we're the white people, but who's the white people? And what does that mean? And it's used today as well, but today in a very different context. So I kind of think that there's so much there for even a future project about what is Italian whiteness going forward. Okay, two more things. Bob Marley was another area which I suddenly, his kind of reverence for him in Italy. And this, you know, he is really revered, and especially from the 70s generation. And I thought that he would be kind of, where does he fit in reggae? Where does reggae fit into this? And there was also Italian reggae as well. Home produced reggae, if you like, white reggae as well in the Italian music scene, which is not just from more recently, but going back. Last thing I think was this point, and there's one more thing in my notes somewhere, where is it? Yeah, the language of racism and anti-racism. When do Italians learn the language of racism? Because in the period you're talking about, it's not very explicit. They certainly learn it in the 80s and 90s. And this leads me to the example about sport. The first Black players who started to arrive with the mass of foreign players in football in the 80s and 90s were not racially abused in the stadiums. It never happened. And then the crowd learnt how to do that. So where did that language come from? And now it's commonplace every week, every day, every match. It's still being repeated 20, 30 years later. But they didn't have that language, even though there were Black players in the 60s and 70s, the occasional ones, many, many fewer than today. And this leads me to the last point, which is about sport, which is your work really made me think about the Black presence in Italian sport and how that all of these issues come together around Black stars, Black footballers, Black basketball players, of which there are many. I was thinking about Kobe Bryant, who, I mean, there's an amazing photo of him. He went to school in Italy, and he's the only Black person in the class, right? Kobe Bryant, I mean, you know, one of the greatest basketball players in history, went to school in Italy, learned Italian. I mean, as that experience glamour, of course, he's the son of a basketball player, but what's going on there with someone like that, you know, and that you know, kind of different status of class as well. And the last example, which is just, these are sort of off the top of my head, but I just started to think about it, was the 1960s Olympics and Wilma Rudolph. And she was called in the Italian press, they gave her a nickname, which is basically racist, which is Gazzella Nera, black gazelle. Now that's interesting in itself. And she is whenever anyone talks about the 60s Olympics and the nostalgic programs held in Rome, they talk about her because she was so good and she was so glamorous and interesting, and also supposedly went out briefly with the Italian star of that Olympics, Livio Berruti. So there was an interracial thing going on there as well. And that all of these touchstone things that you bring out so brilliantly in this paper, I think, are also happening in something already back in 1960 in the Olympics, but no one's talking about them. They're there, but they're not being talked about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
John, for these brilliant comments. And now, Silvana, please, it's your turn to respond.
Well, thank you so much for such stimulating comments, guys. I mean, I have to say that I feel very lucky because I just started to work on this. And so it's great to have, you know, two experts who are actually telling me, you know, where to go and how to also, you know, where I could go, because I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to do this. I mean, first I have to finish the other thing. But thank you so much. I mean, starting with Paul's very useful and very appropriate remarks about right, the longer history of all this, right? I'm aware I couldn't fit it in, but it's true. There is a much longer history behind all this in terms of exchanges, right, between African-American culture. The engagement with African-American culture goes back before. I mean, if we don't want to go to the period of fascism, but right after World War II, there are plenty of translations of works by Langston Hughes and others, right? And that is also needs more exploration. That particular moment with the anti-fascists who are interested, right, in renewing Italian culture. So the engagement is important. The NATO bases in Naples are really quite important also as the ground in which I think people like Daniele probably emerged, right? And Senese too, right? The clubs for American soldiers that existed at the time. So plenty of music of that. So I take absolutely this point. If I were to do this kind of history, certainly that has to be taken into consideration. You're questioning the use of the idea of appropriation. I'm with you in the sense I also feel like there are many limitations to this idea because cultures are traveling, they are not separated, they are not neatly separated by boundaries, national and otherwise. So I'm using that term, and I try to convey. Maybe it was not conveyed well enough in my brief presentation. That I'm taking that terms with caution, because again, it can. You know, misguide us about what is taking place. It can constrain. It's a kind of straitjacket on what happens, in which there is again much more hybridity and trouble of cultures, and also there is too much of a kind of a certain nationalism in using this term, and I try to, again, I'm trying to convey the fact that I'm using it with some warnings, because I think that, you know, it's not good enough for what we were trying to do. So there is not only appropriation, there is a more complex type of interaction that is taking place. At the same time, it's not, I mean, I would not completely reject it. I would still keep it with, you know, with warnings and with qualifications. I mean, consumption of race is everywhere, right? It's just part of the societies that we are, and there is not and appropriation simplifies this kind of thing. And it's something maybe in between, right? Consumption of race is something in between racism and anti-racism, right? It's another area, right, in which we operate. So, I just wanted to make sure that I was not, you know, misunderstood there. But maybe I should, you know, widen my the discussion of that. Thank you for letting me know that. So there is also another history that we should explore more, which is all that this history of the relationship of the left with the empire, right? And this is actually something that's been done, right? And so the, you know, the positioning of the left, the new, the old left and the new left, right? I mean, that's a big history that has to be done there. In terms of moving to the sources, right? The sources, this is a rich source which I saw used in a brilliant paper that I read last year by Simone and Cecilia Brioni on Lara St. Paul. And I was also thinking, why is it that nobody has used these sources, which are so, you know, they can be, can offer so many inroads into that period. So I discovered it again, thanks to someone who is working, some cultural historians are working and literary critics are working in that area. So I felt like there is quite a lot that one can do. I mean, besides the source, one can also talk to people because the people are still around. And I was thinking that this was a bit of a, you know, for me, a work of self-study. You know, I grew up in those years. I mean, I was an adolescent in, you know, in the 70s, and I was, if reading, maybe I was not reading so much of this, but I mean, I was in that culture, and I want to understand how it worked. I mean, what we understood to be, I want to to go back and do a kind of exploration of my own history. And, you know, the many things that went wrong in that period, but maybe the other things that we got a bit more right. Anyway, so it's certainly you know, a work that to me is fascinating on many levels. This type of research and all the things that John was bringing up. You know, you have many. You know, important points, you know, concerning, of course, the status, the question of the status, the class of these, of the type of people that, you know, represented Blackness for young Italians at the time, right, which are clearly very different, right? There is this kind of fascination with African Americans. There is very little on you know, of fascination with others, right? Except if they are sort of in revolt, if they are acting, if there is an agency of some kind. Otherwise, they're not present. The many of these you know, stars, I don't know anything. I know very little about them, and I had no time to do research, but I know that some of them actually stayed, they had their lives in Italy. This is another history to be written. They had, you know, Rocky Roberts and Wess. As far as I know, they naturalized and they lived for many years, so maybe all their lives in Italy. So that's something, again, that should be studied, because there is a formation. Also, if I think about the 1950s, also in the 1950s, there were African Americans who had come to Italy after the war, who stayed in Italy. There is a famous novelist who was there. These are stories that have to be collected in the writing of a Black Italian history. I mean, a history that has still to be written, right, about the presence of Afro-discendenti, of people with a mixed or a Black heritage. So, so it's plenty of work to do there. I think so there are many other things. Bob Marley came to mind, of course, while I was collecting material on that. There is a whole story there about reggae. But I wanted to consider a couple of other things that John brought up. One is this question of, the whiteness of Italian, which is always shaded. It's a kind of, Italians seem to be less than white, and yet when they contrast themselves to others, they become white. And also in this period, in those years, they are, they're still the Southern Italian. There is the distinction between, there was plenty of racism against Southern Italians, but as we know in recent years, Southern Italians have become white too, because they're sort of opposing themselves to the Leicester rivals. Yeah, it's part of that history. I mean, these are pieces of that history also of the color of the Italians. In terms of language, the language of racism and anti-racism, these are right. Anti-racism is a term that started to appear. I mean, that started to be used, I think, not before the 1970s. It became, it started to, and I think that there was really not much, not much reflection or not at all. There was no reflection, as far as I know, on these issues. You know, in the Italian left, at the time there was very little. There was, paradoxically, there was a bit more in some of the, if you look at the newspapers at the time, maybe more reflection in some of the more mainstream media than on the left on these issues. I mean, again, because the left is very, always makes a connection with fascism. I mean, it's fascism is equal racism. So there is that kind of tradition, the anti-fascist tradition that makes, you know, that is used to reflect on the meaning of racism. And beside, outside of that, no, it's much recent. It's a much recent phenomenon. So, so I guess maybe I haven't answered all your questions, but I have very, very much in mind these kind of things all the time while I write this, you know, when I wrote this piece and also, you know, when I discuss it. So thank you again for your responses.
Thank you, Silvana. Thanks a lot.